My name's Arwa, and welcome to the first episode of the Arwa and Augustas Family Kitchen series. And thanks for clicking on this video. If you found yourself to this video, you're either Lithuanian, wondering who this girl is and why she's cooking Lithuanian food, or you're Sudanese or American or from some other part of the world and are curious about learning more about Lithuanian cuisine. What I love about cooking Lithuanian food is that it makes me feel really drawn to Augustas' culture and his country. Another thing I love about Lithuanian cuisine is its emphasis on fresh ingredients. That's actually something that is in common with Sudanese culture as well. Both Sudan and Lithuania are historically agricultural societies, so a lot of our dishes, both Sudanese and Lithuanian dishes, have a lot of fresh ingredients. So without further ado, let's get to it. Tonight for dinner, I'm making a dish that we absolutely love around here. It's a dish that I learned originally from my mother-in-law during her visit to the US right after we had Yusuf. It's a dish that should be fairly familiar to all of you all around the world because it's really just a variation of meatballs. It's a Lithuanian dish called Kotletai. Oftentimes this is made with pork. It can be made with beef. It can be made with turkey. I've made fish kotletai before, but my favorite variation is the one that I'm making tonight, which is a mixture of beef and chicken. I know it sounds a bit weird to mix beef and chicken together, but trust me, it works. It really just ends up tasting like a beef meatball. What I love about mixing in a bit of chicken is that it really cuts some of the gaminess from the beef. It just tastes a little bit more mild on the meat flavor, which is fine because what's really great about this dish and the way that my mother-in-law and the way that I make it in particular are the fresh herbs that we put into it. So you really don't want to taste just exclusively meat. You really want those herbs to shine through. Another thing that I like about it is that sometimes when you make a beef meatball, because the meat is a bit more tough, you have to add breadcrumbs to soften up the meatball a bit. But what I love about adding chicken is that you actually end up not having to add any breadcrumbs at all. Sometimes I'll add rice just because I like the flavor of rice, but actually you don't need to add anything at all. And so fewer carbs, and that's always a great thing. So I use a 1-to-1 mixture of ground chicken to ground beef. I use about a teaspoon and a half of cumin. And again, this is just my mother-in-law's variation. She happens to really like Eastern spices, which works very well for my Sudanese palate. So she uses cumin in it. And then I actually added coriander. I add about half a teaspoon of coriander, ground coriander. And then about a 1/4 teaspoon of pepper, a teaspoon of sea salt or kosher salt, and 2 garlic. Now my mother-in-law actually doesn't put garlic in a lot of her food because my sister-in-law has a really bad garlic allergy, unfortunately, but I'm a huge garlic lover, so is my husband, and it works really well with meat to add garlic. So I do 2 garlic cloves minced. The real stars of this show are the fresh herbs that go in there. There are actually only 2, dill and parsley. I fine chop them and put them both into the meat mixture and then also into the broth that the meatballs are going to finish cooking in. So I just really use a handful of each of parsley and dill. I'm going to fine chop them now, and then they're going to get dumped into, about half of the amount is going to get dumped into the meat mixture, and the other half is going to go into the broth later. All right, so these are looking about right. I usually, if this were a salad or something, I would take better care to cut off all the stems, but they actually have a lot of really great flavor, and the smaller stems that I left in there will cook down pretty well and will lose their bite in the cooking process, so you wouldn't even feel that they're there at all. I did, however, take out like the really large stems, so the ones that, you know, kind of look like broccoli stems. So as I mentioned before, about half this mixture is going to go into the meat mixture, and then the other half is going to go into the broth in which we finish off cooking the meat. I brown the meat first. I'll show you how to shape them. I'll show you exactly how I brown them, but most of the cooking actually happens in the broth, and that broth consists of half an onion and 2 more garlic cloves that I mince in there, and I will get to that a bit later. But first things first, let's make the meatballs. I already have my meat in here. As I mentioned before, it's a 1-to-1 mixture of ground chicken and ground beef. I had that frozen together at the outset. It's all thawed in this bowl. So in here, I'm going to put about half the herbs. I'm going to take half the herbs and just dump them in there, just like that. Maybe I'll take a bit more. We're going to throw in the garlic, the salt, the pepper, the cumin, the coriander, egg. Now, assuming your meat isn't super cold, you can just use your hands. If it's really cold, sometimes I use a potato masher that you do mashed potatoes with, but nothing works as good as your hands. Unfortunately, my meat has thawed at this point, so I'm just going to go in there, mix everything up, and then we'll shape them. All right, let's get in there. It actually feels kind of fun. It's adult Play-Doh. So the mixture is a bit on the softer side, which is really ideal, I think, because this is really supposed to be a meatball that you should be able to cut into pretty easily with a fork. And because it has, you know, the mixture of chicken and beef and that egg, it ends up being a really, really soft meatball. So it works well for my son. I don't have to worry about any choking risks. And once it comes together, should be fairly quickly. It looks like this. Now we're gonna shape the meatballs, and it's going to make a very large number. I can't fry all of them at once, so I put them in a pan that I lined with parchment paper, and this is where they'll sit while I cook. And then after I cook, they'll sit in there a little bit longer as I prepare the broth. Once the broth is done, I'll throw these meatballs in. They'll cook for about half an hour, and then we're ready to eat. Now, I make each meatball about the size of a golf ball. For those of you who are familiar with golf, it's not terribly huge. I mean, it should break down into, you know, 2 or 3 bites, but this is about the amount. It's like a little bit smaller than an egg, I would say. And I like to shape them in a traditional meatball shape, which is round, but then I flatten them a bit. So they're not quite a hamburger, but not quite a round Italian meatball either. And then place it on the sheet, just like that. And now I'm gonna make all of these, and I'm not gonna make you sit here while I do all of them because it's gonna take a while, but we'll just zoom through that part. Okay, so these babies are done. I had to go wash my hands. It is a messy business making kotletai. So you can probably see a fair deal of green on here. As I said, the herbs will cook down. You should be able to taste them, but you shouldn't be able to feel them in your mouth, if that makes any sense. I just love the fact that this recipe calls for herbs. It's a really great way of getting in your antioxidants. I have a really picky toddler, and so just giving him straight up vegetables doesn't often work. And so the more vitamins and minerals that I can fit in through things that he can taste, but he can't feel, things like herbs, and sometimes I'll actually grate a bit of zucchini in here, and again, it just disappears right in there. I didn't do that this time, but yeah, it's a really great way of getting in additional sources of healthy nutrients. So now that these are ready, I'm just going to pan fry them just so they brown on the outside a bit and don't fall apart in the broth. That's really the only purpose here. You're not trying to cook them on your skillet at all. That's not the point. Just want to get a little bit of color on them. I'll do these about 5 to 6 at a time, and it should move fairly quickly. All right, let's get to it. All right, we're gonna turn the stovetop onto medium high. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons, just kind of eyeball it, of olive oil to the pan. Let it get nice and hot, and then we're going to throw in the meatballs. As you can see, the pan is pretty hot, so now I'm going to start putting in the meatballs. Moving quickly because the oil is hot, fry the meatballs 5 to 6 at a time. They only need about 2 minutes per side. Again, the goal here isn't to cook them because they'll cook in the broth later. You just want them to have a slight crust on the outside so they don't fall apart when they're added to the liquid later. This is what they'll end up looking like. They have some color on the outside, but aren't cooked at all on the inside. They'll cook later. If you were to feel them, you'd feel a slight crust, and this will help keep them together once you're added to the liquid. All right, now that our kotletai are browned, I'm going to get started on the broth. Now, this is a super versatile broth. I obviously use it when I make kotletai. However, I've also used it to just, simmer some shrimp. I've thrown chicken in the broth. It tastes really good, and all you need to accompany it is some rice, which is actually cooking in the background here. You need about half an onion, 2 garlic cloves, and I'm actually going to throw in a bit more cumin, and just for some kick, I'm going to add about a 1/4 teaspoon of curry, and that's about 3/4 teaspoon cumin, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of curry. I'm also going to throw in some zucchini. It's a vegetable that's really popular around here, and there aren't a lot of vegetables that are popular in our household with our 2.5-year-old. But zucchini is really great. It doesn't really have a lot of flavor, but it has the nutrients of a vegetable, so that's great. Also, just a bit of nostalgia. Augustas grew up in the countryside, and they grew zucchini, they grew dill, and so from just a trip down memory lane perspective, zucchini is a vegetable that he quite enjoys. It's one that my mother-in-law cooks with a lot. My father-in-law makes really good blines and pancakes with zucchini that are really popular here. My mother's tasted them, my father's tasted them, my sister just adores them. Friends who've come over while they visited have had them as well, and they're really, really good with a bit of jam, and I'll make them one of these days. So yes, I'll be throwing in some zucchini in there, just process-wise, since I will be speeding up the process a bit from here on out for a bit of a stretch. I'm going to fine chop the onion. I'm going to mince the garlic. I'm going to throw them into about a tablespoon of oil, get them a little bit browned, and then I'm going to throw in the zucchini and the spices. From there, I'm going to add the kotletai in there, and then I'm going to add enough liquid, and that liquid can either be water or it can be vegetable broth. I'm personally a fan of vegetable broth or chicken broth. Just adds a little bit more depth of flavor, and I'm just going to add enough to cover them. So this is really just kind of depending on how much you make. The recipe will require a different amount of liquid, but I like to just have them cover the kotletai, and they'll just simmer in that broth for a bit, about half an hour, just to make sure that they're really well cooked. You don't want to get salmonella. There's chicken in there and egg, so half an hour should do it, and then dinner should be ready, and by then the rice will be done as well. So all right, let's get chopping on these onions. Funny story, I am like super sensitive to onions. It really doesn't take very much at all. A half an onion will do it. I need a moment, guys. All right, back to it. Next up is zucchini. We are going to cut the zucchini into half moons, for lack of a better description. Just basically bite-sized pieces. Cut them however you want. I'm partial to half moons. All right. Friends, home stretch. The zucchini is cut. The onions are chopped. You might have noticed I went ahead and minced the garlic directly into the onion. They will saute together before I add the spices and the zucchini, so they can go in the same bowl. We're going to move it over to the stove, where I'm going to start putting this all together. We're almost done, guys. This will be about a tablespoon and a half of olive oil. Don't need to go crazy here. There's not a ton of onion or garlic. And then the liquid is really what's cooking the meat. So we're gonna put in our olive oil, turn it on. I actually heard somewhere that you're supposed to heat up the pan really hot before adding the olive oil. I kind of just do it both simultaneously. Hasn't affected my cooking. I've been told my food is good, so we're just going to do it this way. Once the olive oil is really hot, I'm going to toss in the garlic and the onion. Those are going to brown. I'll show you what color I get them before I add the zucchini and the spices, but generally I'll be moving pretty quickly. Alright, so these babies are starting to brown a bit. This is a good time as any to throw in the zucchini. And stir. The onions have softened up quite a bit, and we want the zucchini to just get a little bit of color, not a ton, before we put everything else in there. I would stir that for about a minute. Now once these are in here, you only stir them for about 15-20 seconds just to open up those spices a bit with the oil. It smells really good. Before we put in our kotletai. Now because these have been sitting for a while, even though they're quite a soft meatball as I mentioned, they're not falling apart at all. Just going to give this a really quick stir. I don't want the meatballs to start falling apart on me. And at this point, I'm going to add the broth. Now I mentioned you want just enough to cover. I'm going to use 2 cups in this case. If I end up covering it before, I'll use a little bit less, but this is really something that you can kind of eyeball. You can also just use plain water. I just enjoy the flavor of broth, and it gives it a really nice color. Whatever, broth. So I'm actually going to leave about a 1/4 cup left. I only ended up using 1 3/4. I just wanted to slightly cover most of the meatballs. If that makes sense. If I wasn't using zucchini, I'd probably go ahead and put the rest of this in. However, I found that once zucchini cooks down, it does release a lot of liquid, and I just don't want this to be a very soupy mixture. So I think with the 1 3/4, I'm probably good. And then you'll see that the zucchini actually kind of adds to the volume of liquid by the end of this. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on to high. Once it starts boiling, I'm going to cover it and then lower it to about a medium low, and just let that simmer and let the entire thing simmer for about ½ an hour, just to make sure that the meat is really well cooked on the inside. Once that ½ hour is over, I'm going to throw the herbs in there, cover the pot, let it cook for another 2-3 minutes, just until those herbs get wilted and get incorporated into the broth. But their flavor will be quite salient at the end, which is fantastic. As you can see, it's really starting to boil pretty quickly. Once it's at that fast boil stage, you want to cover it. Again, lower it to medium, low. Let it do its thing for ½ an hour. Okay friends, we've almost reached the end of this journey. It's been about 25 minutes. As you can see, the liquid has increased in volume, mostly because of that zucchini that we added. If you don't add zucchini, then the liquid should pretty much stay the same if you have it covered. I do want it to reduce just a little bit, so I took off the cover. But about at this point, at about, you know, the 25-minute mark, I add in the herbs, and I let them cook in there for a few minutes. You know, 2 or 3 minutes should be fine. I'll probably leave it a little bit longer, maybe around 5 or 6 minutes, just because I do want that liquid to reduce. My heat is still at about medium low. I'm going to increase that to closer to medium high, and I'll just keep an eye on it so nothing burns. And I'll show you what it looks like at the end. So I just turned it off. I'll show you what it looks like. So since I used broth here, and it was store-bought broth, it already had a good amount of salt in it. You probably noticed I didn't give any specifications for how much salt you should be adding. I also don't add pepper, just because I already added pepper to the meatballs, and the herbs do most of the heavy lifting for the broth that the Kotletai cook in. So I don't add pepper. And for salt, I'm really not going to add very much at all, again, because I did use that store bought broth, which comes with its own salt. I think I'm just going to add just a little bit. I couldn't even tell you how much this is. Maybe an 1/8 of a teaspoon, if I had to guess, would be enough. Give that a stir, and I'll show you what it looks like. So yeah, the soup is reduced quite a bit. The zucchini has pretty much disintegrated. I specifically did it that way just because, again, my son is really picky, and I don't want him to freak out at the sight of zucchini, which he loves when it's mushy like this, but might love a little bit less when it's, you know, in its normal raw looking format. I'm going to transfer this over to a bowl. I'll show you how I plate everything. We are huge pickle fans in this house, and this pairs so well with pickles. In fact, I would go so far as to say eating it with pickles is an absolute must. To give you an idea of how much we love pickles, we always have this huge jar of pickles. It is 1.36 liters of pickles, and we have multiple of these in stock. Pickles go really fast. My son loves snacking on them. They are pretty high in salt for a 2.5-year-old, so I'll usually soak them in some water just to let some of the salt reduce a little bit, and it's not terrible for him. I'll also ply him with water when he eats pickles, and he'll definitely have water with this meal as opposed to milk, which he'll often have with dinner. Okay, so going to plate. I'll show you what the plating looks like, and then my family and I are going to dig in. Here's our bowl of delicious kotletai. We have some white rice. We are partial to jasmine rice. I think it works really well with this dish. And of course, our pickles. The table is set. Now it's time to call over the boys. Augustas, Yusuf.
Hey.
Matt is valgite. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to see more content like this, please hit subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know if you end up making this yummy dish. You can also follow us on Instagram at Arwa _Augustas, where we regularly upload fun family content.